Welcome back to Chapter 16. This is our second part of Chapter 16. We are going to be looking at product costs, and there again are going to be some terms that you should probably memorize. This section is one of the most important as far as understanding the terms and being able to identify some of the terms that you are going to hear. We are going to use, for the most part, guitar as an example, and here we are looking at the manufacturing process. Almost everything we're discussing in this class is going to be production or manufacturing something. The easiest way to kind of segregate some of these terms is to think of the production being done in a separate building somewhere. So you're going to have your production facility or your manufacturing facility that is putting everything together. Once that product is finished and complete, then think of it being moved across the street and put out onto the sales floor into a completely separate building. Maybe that will help segregate some of these things. So we're going to be talking a lot about cost and trying to understand the cost of these products. In financial accounting, we looked at a merchandiser, and they would basically just buy their inventory already done. They knew exactly how much it cost them. They would put their markup on it, put it on the sales floor. In managerial accounting, we aren't buying our inventory, we're building it, and a lot goes into building that inventory. A lot of raw materials, a lot of labor, and the cost of our facility. All of those things have to be incorporated into the cost of that product so that we can put a price tag on it. That's the hardest part of managerial accounting, is figuring out our cost. So cost is anything we have to pay to get this product built and again generate some revenue. Costs are related to, we call it a cost object, and a cost object can be anything. It could be the product we're building, a sales territory, a specific department. Most of what we're going to be looking at is costs to build a product. And costs with these products that we are building are either going to be labeled as direct or indirect costs. Direct costs are those things that can be directly identified to our product. And our example for our guitars, the cost of the wood. We should know exactly how much wood we need to build each guitar. We should know exactly how many strings we need to put on those guitars and the cost of it. Indirect costs are those costs that we know went into that product, but for whatever reason, maybe they're fairly immaterial or fairly small amounts. They're difficult to trace, and while you probably could, it would take too much time. So indirect costs are costs that we know we incurred to get this product done, but we don't want to take the time to try to detail it out. Salaries of the supervisors are considered an indirect cost. We have to pay the supervisors, but they aren't directly putting our product together. So here's a visual, there's our guitar there. Direct costs that we know are going directly into that thing. There's our wood, there's our strings, there's all of our other little pieces, and all of those pieces we know exactly how many are going into each guitar. And I know exactly the cost of each of those things. Indirect costs are again our supervisor. We know we are incurring a cost, but we can't really put a price on the amount of time that he spends on each guitar, or things. If there's glue, I don't know if they use glue for guitars, I have no idea, but if they're using glue to glue any of these pieces together, again, there's a cost to that glue, but we're not going to sit and measure how many ounces we've used on each one. So we come up with a way to allocate those costs. Indirect costs, again, those costs we can't specifically identify, but we know are somewhere in that product. That becomes part of our overhead. So again, there's a little visual to help classify direct and indirect costs. We identify the costs. We know exactly we're paying for wood, we're paying for strings, we're paying for our supervisor to make sure we have enough staff. We probably have repair or janitorial staff to help make sure our facility is working properly. All of those costs, if they can be directly traced to that final product, they're direct costs. If we can't trace them directly to that finished product, we are going to label them as an indirect cost, and they are considered part of overhead. All right, so indirect costs become overhead. So again, we're talking about a manufacturing company here, and all the costs that go into manufacturing product include all of the costs of the materials used. Again, those direct materials and those indirect materials. In addition to all of those materials, we have to convert those materials into a finished product. And converting them usually takes some sort of labor or machinery that is automated. The three main pieces of manufacturing costs, and again, you want to memorize these three things. Manufacturing costs are made up of direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. All right, again, those three manufacturing costs: direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. You want to memorize those three things, and you want to know that those three things are manufacturing costs. And there's an example. Direct materials, again, the wood. Direct labor are the actual people touching that thing and putting it together. And factory overhead is anything we have to pay to support that factory. The rent on the building, the property taxes, the utilities, the depreciation on the machinery in that facility. All right, so direct materials, they start with raw materials. Again, when you think back to your merchandising companies, they have one type of inventory, right? It's already ready to go. They purchase it, slap a price tag on it, and throw it out on their sales room floor. Manufacturers have three different types of inventory. The first one is their raw materials inventory. Those raw materials are where you're going to be pulling your product or your pieces from and turning them into a finished goods. So again, direct materials, they are directly traceable to that finished product, and they are a significant portion of the cost. So some examples, again, the wood in the guitar, electronic components in a television, an automobile. Some of the direct materials are the tires. I know that there are going to be 4 or 5 tires if there's a spare in every automobile that rolls off my assembly line. I know it's going to have 1 steering wheel. I know it's going to have X amount of metal or fiberglass that is the body of that vehicle. And I can directly trace all of those things to that finished product. Labor can also be divided into direct labor or indirect labor. And direct labor are those employees physically touching that product and assembling it or inspecting it or doing whatever they have to do to turn it into that finished product. And it, just like direct materials, direct labor has to be an integral part of that finished product and a significant portion of the cost. And examples of our direct labor are the employees cutting out that lumber and assembling it and making that guitar, mechanics repairing automobiles, anyone on a manufacturing or assembly line is a direct labor. And anything else that's not direct labor or direct materials is considered overhead. All right, sometimes overhead is called burden. All factory overhead costs are indirect costs of the product, right? So those incidentals, I guess, that we have to incur in order to get this product built. So again, those indirect materials, the little things, all the nuts and bolts that are too numerous to count. You're not going to count all the bolts that are in that automobile you put together, or you're not going to weigh how many ounces of glue you're putting into each, guitar. So that's part of overhead. Indirect labor, right? Our direct labor are our assembly line workers. Indirect labor are those individuals we're paying to help keep the factory operating, but aren't necessarily touching and assembling that product. Our supervisors, our maintenance and repair workers, the janitorial staff, that's all indirect labor, which is a part of overhead. And anything else, repairing and maintaining the factory equipment, insurance on the building, depreciation, utility bills on the factory, if we're paying rent on the factory, all of that goes into getting these products built and finished, but aren't a direct, how do I want to say that they're not directly traceable to that finished product. All right, so you want to be sure you can classify anything as direct materials, direct labor, or overhead. All right, and again, factory overhead also includes materials and labor that aren't directly in those finished products. Okay, so Again, if it's not directly tied to that product, but you know it's in there. The cost of oil to lubricate the machinery, and again, the janitorial and supervisory employees. All right, we already talked about that. All right, so let's try to identify these things here. Direct materials, direct labor, or overhead for a baseball glove manufacturer. All right, leather used to make a baseball glove. Well, if I'm manufacturing baseball gloves, I should have a pretty good idea of exactly how much leather I'm going to have to use for each glove. And the leather is the biggest part of that glove. That's the most substantial part of it. That's going to be a direct material. The coolants in the machines that sew the baseball gloves. Right, so I have some heavy machinery that are sewing these things together. I need to keep them oiled up and cooled so they don't overheat and jam. So that isn't a direct part of those finished gloves, but it's a cost I have to incur to get those gloves put together. That's going to be an indirect material. And indirect materials are factory overhead. The wages of the assembly line employees, those assembly line employees are directly putting those gloves together. They're touching it and making sure they're complete. Those are direct labor. The ink used to print autographs on the gloves. Again, we're going to incur a cost for that ink, but I'm not going to sit and count and how many ounces of ink is going onto each glove. It would just take too much time. So that ink, again, is going to be some indirect material, and indirect materials are labeled factory overhead. Now those manufacturing costs of direct materials, direct labor, and overhead can be grouped together, again, to analyze different things. The most common groupings you'll see are prime costs and conversion costs. Prime costs are what is going in directly to that product, direct materials and direct labor. Conversion cost is what is taking taking that product and converting it into something saleable. And that's, again, part of your direct labor, because they are the ones taking those direct materials and turning them into something else. And then all of the factory overhead, the machinery, all of that stuff, the costs are considered conversion costs. Direct labor is considered both. There's a little visual. I actually have another chart that I think shows this a little bit better that I will post for you. Again, so direct labor is considered both prime and a conversion cost. All right, so let's try to identify these things: prime cost, conversion cost, or both. All right, back to our baseball glove. The leather used to make the baseball glove. All right, we already decided that was a direct material. Direct material is a prime cost. Those coolants for the machines that sew the baseball gloves. That coolant, remember, we decided was an indirect material, which was overhead. So factory overhead is considered a conversion cost. The wages of the assembly line employees. Now, our assembly line employees are direct labor. Direct labor is both a prime cost and a conversion cost. We need that direct labor directly, it's directly associated with that product, but that direct labor is really what's turning it into that finished product. So it's a little bit of both. And again, that ink that was used, that ink we classified as an indirect material, which is factory overhead. And again, factory overhead is conversion cost. All right, so you should be able to identify that sort of thing. And the last part of this section, for financial reporting purposes, all of these costs that we're talking about, direct materials, direct labor, overhead, the conversion costs, they can be classified into product or period costs. And we classify them in this way for our financial statements. So product costs, remember, product costs are anything that goes into getting that product finished. And that's going to be all of your manufacturing costs. And remember, manufacturing costs are made up of those three things: direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. All right, so anything direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, those are your product costs. Once that product is finished and you've moved it now across the street into your showroom floor, anything else, any other costs you incur to get that product sold is a period costs. And that's going to be all of your selling and admin. All right, that happens after the fact, after it's finished. All right, and there's some examples for you. There's period costs, again, after that thing is done and ready to be sold. You're going to advertise it. You've got your sales staff. They may be paid commission depending on the type of industry it is, and any of the office salaries, your accounting staff, any office supplies, and depreciation expense on the office building. Okay, so note there's depreciation on the factory, which is factory overhead, and then depreciation for the administrative side of things, and that is going to be your period costs. All right, so keep that separate. I know a lot of things, all these words getting tossed at you. Now again, product costs, again, those are your direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. As you are incurring those costs, they are recorded and held on the balance sheet as inventory. Product costs are sometimes called inventoriable costs. Okay, make sure you understand that. Product costs, direct materials, direct labor, and overhead, are sometimes known as inventoriable costs. They hang out there in inventory, even though it's a cost, right? We think of costs as being an expense, but direct material, direct labor, and overhead costs stay in your inventory until the product is complete. All right, so we just absorb all these costs and keep the cost of our inventory growing until it's complete. Period costs get reported as they're incurred. So as you pay your sales staff, you've got a sales expense. As you pay for advertising, you've got advertising expense. So they show up as expenses on the income statement as they're paid. The product costs, they hang out in inventory until the product is complete and sold, and then all of those costs become cost of goods sold. All right, so there's another visual that kind of separates your product costs and your period costs. And again, you can see, where's my, do I have my cursor? Let me see if I can find it. It doesn't want to work. There it is. All right, so there are these product costs. Remember, direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. And those product costs hang out, and all those costs just kind of keep getting accumulated in your inventory until that product is finished and sold, and then all of those costs will become cost of goods sold. I think, nope, we got one more. All right, so product cost or period cost. Back to our baseball glove manufacturer. The leather used to make the baseball glove. All right, we already said it's direct materials. So is direct material product or period costs? Direct materials, that's our product cost. The cost of the endorsement from a professional baseball player. All right, an endorsement from a professional baseball player. He's going to talk about your glove, and hopefully because people like him, they're going to buy the glove. Maybe his autograph's on it. That is kind of an after the fact thing. So that's going to be a period cost. That's kind of an advertising. Office supplies used at the company headquarters. Again, that has nothing to do with our manufacturing side of things. So that's also going to be a period costs. And then the ink for that autograph. Remember that ink we said was a indirect material. Indirect material is part of overhead, and overhead is part of our product cost. All right. So hopefully that helps you understand that. I know a lot of the homework will go through classifying these things, and hopefully it will make all of that a little bit more clear. And I believe that is the end of part 2. Let me double check. Yes. All right. And we'll be back for part 3.